today we're going to be going through quite a complicated history of the IRA during World War II and their Nazi collaboration, or was it actually collaboration that they did with the Nazis? So for a bit of background, first we're going to go through who were the IRA. So the IRA, or the Irish Republican Army, was formed to fight the British during the War of Independence. They were an irregular force that employed guerrilla warfare tactics to great effect against Crown forces. After the Anglo-Irish Treaty was accepted, the IRA split into two sides, the pro-treaty and the anti-treaty sides, as the Civil War began. The pro-treaty side became the National Army, and the anti-treaty side continued as the IRA, with Eamon de Valera as its political leader. The Civil War ended with a victory for the pro-treaty National Army. The Civil War was an extremely divisive event in Irish history, and it split Irish society deeply. Even though the IRA lost the war, they were still widely supported. After the Civil War, the IRA's political element was left-leaning, which flew in the face of the more right-leaning Conservative government at the time. The IRA had members that subscribed to a broad range of far-left ideologies, including communism, but the main aim of the IRA was to create a united socialist republic. When Moss Toomey took over as IRA Chief of Staff in 1926, he began to foster IRA-Soviet relations. In 1925, the IRA sent a delegation to Russia to meet with Joseph Stalin. They hoped that the Soviets would be able to supply them with arms and ammunition. A pact was agreed upon where the IRA would spy on the United States and the United Kingdom and report their findings to Red Army military intelligence in New York and in London, in exchange for a payment of £500 a month, over $25,000 in today's money. A pact was signed off by Frank Aiken, who would later leave the IRA to form the political party Fianna Fáil with Eamon de Valera. This agreement lasted until the start of the 1930s, with the IRA reporting on specifications of British submarine, detector sonar, aeroplane engines for bombers, military journals and manuals and gas masks. The IRA agent in the United States, codenamed Mr. Jones, also forwarded reports from the Army's Chemical Weapons Service, state-of-the-art gas masks, machine gun and aeroplane engine specifications, and reports from Navy, Air Service and Army. The IRA remained prepared to take over the country by force, as they felt that the new Free State government, with its censorship and coercive legislation, was too similar to the British government that they had fought so hard to remove. In 1926, the IRA took over 11 Garda barracks, killing 2 Gardaí in the process. The government responded by using an emergency power to arrest 110 IRA members. IRA Chief of Staff Moss Toomey was not a communist nor a Soviet sympathiser. He saw the IRA's pact with the Soviets as a means to an end and described the Soviet government as shifty and out to exploit us. In 1932, Eamon de Valera, the man who was instrumental in the political split in Ireland which led to the Civil War, a man who backed the anti-treaty IRA, rose to power when his Fianna Fáil party won the election of that year. The IRA benefited from this rise to power as de Valera legalised the organisation and was generally sympathetic towards the IRA. On his victory tour in Skibbereen, for example, he snubbed the Garda Guard of Honour but saluted the IRA one. At this time, the Irish answer to the Brown Shirts and Black Shirt was formed, led by former IRA member, former National Army General, former Garda Commissioner and former TD, Owen Duffy. The Blue Shirts and the IRA often clashed in street fights, but at least one person from both sides was shot. The Blue Shirts represented the Irish right while the IRA were left-wing. By the mid-1930s, the IRA branded de Valera a sellout, as he had not declared a 32-county republic, and in 1936 de Valera outlawed the IRA due to their increased criminal activity, which included bank robbing and shooting at police during strikes. Moss Toomey was imprisoned and was succeeded as Chief of Staff by Sean MacBride. To his credit, de Valera did bring in government reform. He established the Irish President as the elected head of state, abolished the oath of allegiance to the British monarch, which was a term laid out in the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and made a territorial claim to Northern Ireland. This action brought about huge public support and meant that less and less people supported the IRA as the army of the Republic. During this time, many ex-IRA members left to fight on the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War. It is also worth noting that Eamon Duffy led an Irish brigade to fight on the nationalist side. The IRA banned its members from fighting in the Spanish Civil War, but some went anyway. The most notable of these was ex-IRA man Frank Ryan, who along with many other Irishmen fought as part of the International Brigade. In 1937, Tom Barry, mastermind of the Kilmichael ambush, succeeded MacBride as IRA Chief of Staff. In January 1937, he had taken a trip to Germany, seeking German support, which was assured to him, subject to conditions, that the IRA limited its actions to British military installations once war was declared. Barry presented his plan for working with the Germans at the Army Convention in April 1938, but it was decided to go with Sean Russell's S plan. This led to Barry's resignation as IRA Chief of Staff. Russell would become IRA Chief of Staff in 1938. Russell was a veteran of the 1916 Rising, War of Independence and Civil War, having fought on the anti-treaty side. The S-Plan was a plan aimed to sabotage British civil, economical and military infrastructure. Russell stated, "England's difficulty, Ireland's opportunity, has ever been the watchword of the Gael. Now is the time for Irishmen to take up arms and strike a blow for the Ulster people." Russell entrusted Jim O'Donovan with making the S-Plan a reality. O'Donovan was an explosive expert, having developed his skills fighting the British during the War of Independence and fighting the National Army in the Civil War. O'Donovan had not been involved with the IRA since the end of the Civil War. In December 1938, the Abwehr, being aware of the IRA's bombing campaign, prepared an agent, Oscar Faust, to seek out the IRA leadership, make contact, ask if they would be interested in cooperating with Germany, and if so, to send a liaison man to Germany to discuss specific plans and future coordination. Faust travelled to Ireland in February 1939 under the cover of being a German journalist. The German lack of knowledge of the IRA was evident when Faust attempted to contact Eoin O'Duffy, the former leader of the Blue Shirts, who clashed with the IRA in the 1930s. O'Duffy refused to help Faust, but his secretary did put Faust in contact with former IRA Chief of Staff Moss Toomey. Toomey took Faust to a Dublin safe house, and once satisfied that he was the genuine article, set up a meeting with Sean Russell and Jim O'Donovan, who could speak German. Faust was either unable or not authorised to answer many of the IRA leaders' questions. It was decided that they should visit Germany to further their discussions, and a one-punch note was torn in half, with one half given to Faust as a means of identifying the delegate that the IRA would send over for future discussions. O'Donovan later described Faust as a real SS type. Jim O'Donovan was sent to Germany to further discussions with German government in 1939. He made 3 trips. The topics discussed during these discussions were the possibility of reviving the English campaign in the event of war, the IRA's capability in England, Northern Ireland and Ireland, the policies, intentions, probable reactions of the Dublin government to any outbreak of hostilities between Nazi Germany and Britain, the standard of IRA capabilities and their exact arms requirements. On his last trip to Germany, O'Donovan's host told him that the war would be declared probably within 1 week. A few days later, Germany invaded Poland, signalling the start of World War II. Independent of any German input, the military aspect of the S-Plan began in January 1939 with the declaration of war sent to the British government by the IRA. Sean Russell undertook the political phase of the plan by touring America. This was important as the IRA relied on Republican sympathisers in the US to fund them. Stephen Hayes was left as acting Chief of Staff in his absence. A few days later, London and Manchester were both bombed, with one person being killed. An attempt was made on Francis Chamberlain's life in Kerry, but the bomb was discovered and exploded before any harm could come to the British Prime Minister's son. The IRA continued its bombing campaign, mainly targeting the British rail network, and while people were injured, there were no further deaths. The British authorities also had success in capturing IRA bomb makers, bombers and other IRA members associated with the bombing campaign. In August 1939, the IRA detonated a bomb in Coventry, killing 5 and injuring 70. 2 of the 5 suspects, James Richards and Peter Barnes, were sentenced to death. The sentencing triggered a series of IRA attacks on British post offices and mail trains. The S-Plan ran into the outbreak of the Second World War and finished in March 1940. During the campaign, there were 300 explosions, 10 deaths and 96 injuries. Back home, the IRA also remained active, carrying out operations to complement the S-Plan. On the 23rd of December 1939, IRA members stole almost the entire reserve ammunition store of the Irish Army from the magazine fort in Dublin's Phoenix Park. This became known as the Christmas Raid. This raid caused emergency legislation to be rushed through the Dáil, allowing for internment, military tribunal and execution of IRA members. Thanks to this legislation, at least 6 IRA volunteers were executed in Ireland between 1940 and 1944. In February 1940, a German agent named Ernest Weber Droll landed in Sligo aboard U-37. He liaised with Jim O'Donovan, bringing cash and a wireless transmitter which he later lost on the landing. Weber Droll also delivered a message from the Abwehr asking that the IRA focus on more military targets as part of the S-Plan. Acting Chief of Staff of the IRA, Stephen Hayes, drew up plans for a joint German and IRA invasion of Northern Ireland. These plans were drawn up without Sean Russell's knowledge and were viewed as unworkable by the German authorities. In May 1940, Sean Russell arrived in Berlin and was afforded the privileges of a diplomat, including a villa and a chauffeur-driven car. Russell would train with the Abwehr for 3 months, being trained in the use of the latest German ordnance. Despite their support and training, Russell did not like the Nazis. He described his relationship with the Germans as follows. Germany is no more to me than England is. I asked and accepted German aid in the shape of arms and an expeditionary force. We neither asked for nor accepted German gold, nor had any traffic with Germany except what I state. My aim was to win Irish freedom. When his training was finished, Russell was to be transported back to Ireland via U-boat as part of Operation Dove. 3 days before Russell left for Ireland, Frank Ryan, former member of the IRA who had left Ireland to fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War, was handed over to the Abwehr, having served time in a Spanish prison. Russell asked Ryan to accompany him back to Ireland as part of Operation Dove, and Ryan agreed. After leaving for Ireland, Russell became ill and complained of stomach pains. The crew of U-65 did not include a doctor, and Russell died on the 14th of August, 100 miles short of Galway. He was buried at sea, and the mission was aborted. Ryan returned to Berlin as an unwilling guest of the German government. Stephen Hayes would go on to consider Ryan as the IRA's sole representative in Germany, despite Ryan no longer being a member of the IRA. Despite Ryan being a victim of circumstance, the fact that he was considered as part of the IRA may have helped him fly under the radar of German authorities, who would have been very interested in a former officer of the International Brigade. Ryan would never return to Ireland and died in Dresden in 1944. By 1941, the IRA numbered fewer than 1,000 members, many of whom were in prison thanks to the Irish government's policy of internment. In February 1942, Abwehr agent Gunter Schutz was parachuted into Ireland and was captured almost immediately, but later escaped. The IRA intended to send him back to Germany with a request for weapons, ammunition, explosives, radio equipment and money. Schutz was caught just hours before he was to set sail, as the IRA courier delivering a message to Schutz to bring back to Germany was captured. In 1942, the IRA's Northern Campaign began, aimed at attacking British authorities and undermining the war effort in Northern Ireland. The IRA mainly targeted the RUC and were supplied with arms and ammunition from the Western and Eastern commands of the IRA. On the 2nd of September 1942, volunteer Tom Williams, 19, was hanged, the first and only Irish Republican to be judicially executed in the North. The Northern Campaign mainly consisted of attacks on RUC, sabotage and prison breaks. The campaign came to an end in 1944, leaving 3 IRA men and 6 RUC officers dead. By 1944, the IRA had been decimated by government policy both north and south of the border and the decline of its support due to constitutional changes that the government of Ireland had brought in. After the war, the IRA still existed, but most of the command structure of the IRA had been destroyed, and many of the units that were left existed in isolation without any sort of GHQ to tie them together. The IRA would remain in this weakened state and would not conduct any sizable operations until the border campaign of the mid-1950s. As it is clear from the researching this video, the IRA did not support Nazi Germany or want to establish a fascist state in Ireland. The IRA used the Abwehr in order to further their own goals that happened to be beneficial for Germany. Thanks to the policies implemented by the Government of Ireland, the IRA and Abwehr plans were rendered ineffective due to the members of these organisations being interred. Once again, thank you for watching, and if you want to learn more, you can read from the sources that we used to create this video, which are available in the video description.